Jake Reiner believed that Christmas would finally bring him a moment of peace. After a long and painful separation, he longed to return to his Brentwood home, sit down with his parents, and let things slow down, as if the family could start over. But before that could happen, a single phone call on the night of December 14th shattered it all. The news Jake received not only ended that fragile hope, but also forced him to confront a truth that would change his life forever. If you're interested in the stories behind the Hollywood lights, where tragedy often arrives silently, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss insightful and authentic analyses like this. Jake Reiner truly believed that Christmas would finally be complete. He meticulously planned everything, harboring the hope of returning to his Brentwood home and sitting down with his parents after a long, painful, and silent separation. In Jake's mind, it should have been a new beginning, a rare moment of quiet where things could slow down and his family could have a chance to mend the long-standing rifts. But on the night of December 14th, all those fragile hopes crumbled in a single phone call. What Jake heard changed his life forever. His parents, Rob Reiner and Michelle, were gone. The shock came so quickly, leaving him no time to prepare, so heavy that he could barely breathe. And then, something even more devastating than the loss appeared. A name was mentioned shortly afterward, in a way Jake had never imagined. That was Nick Reiner, his younger brother, the one Jake had once wholeheartedly protected, trusted, and loved unconditionally. The pain came like a raging wave, sweeping away not only grief, but also doubt, anger, and a feeling of betrayal all at once. When Jake appeared on KCBS shortly afterward, he said something that silenced the entire room. "I warned my parents." Then he continued, his voice low and heavy. "I always feared that one day, he would do something irreversible." Those words resonated like a powerful blow, not just in the studio, but far beyond. That moment wasn't simply an emotional outburst. It was the collapse of a belief Jake had carried for years. He chose to speak out about the hidden aspects of his own family, things previously concealed behind a facade of perfection. Jake spoke of years of silent indulgence and pampering, which, he believed, had inadvertently allowed serious problems to grow without anyone daring to confront them. Pain was inevitable, but Jake understood he couldn't remain silent any longer. Therefore, when Nick called him afterward, pleading for help, asserting his innocence and hoping Jake would support him, Jake refused. That decision didn't stem from cruelty or a desire for revenge. Jake believed their family had been fractured long before this point, and some of those cracks had been left unhealed for too long to be easily mended with apologies or familial affection. By December 17th, Los Angeles was eerily quiet, as if the entire city were enveloped in a heavy, suffocating silence. While Nick ascended the cold steps of the courthouse at one end of the city, Jake sat inside the KCBS studio, a place that had been the center of much of his youth and career. The familiar, safe room now seemed strange, heavier than ever. Under the studio lights, Jake looked noticeably thinner. Long nights of sleeplessness had left deep dark circles under his eyes, and the oversized black suit on his tall frame seemed heavy not only because of the fabric, but also because of years of stress and unspoken secrets. This was not the familiar image of a calm and confident reporter that viewers were used to seeing. Before them was a man slowly being worn down by loss and the truth. Jake sat upright, but his shoulders were stiff. His hands were clasped too tightly, his knuckles pale with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse, each word seemingly stuck in his throat. "I've sat here through so many long nights," he said, "but never a night like this." From that moment, Jake began to tell his story, not in a clear chronological order, but through fragmented memories, sometimes surging with intensity, sometimes sinking into silence. Growing up with the name Reiner, which outwardly seemed glamorous and desirable, Jake often felt like wearing a coat that never quite fit. Born in May 1991 in Los Angeles, Jake Reiner is the eldest son of filmmaker Rob Reiner and photographer Michelle Reiner. From a young age, he was surrounded by creativity. Laughter filled the house. Endless stories were told, and classic films were shown repeatedly as a natural part of daily life. The family was also deeply shaped by his grandfather, Carl Reiner, a great icon with a sharp sense of humor and intellect. The home seemed warm, vibrant, and full of love, and in many ways, that was true. But it was never perfect. Jake grew up with his younger sister Romy and brother Nick. As the eldest, he quickly learned to step back, adapt to circumstances, and quietly shoulder responsibility. Over time, Jake realized that giving in to Nick seemed like a given, almost a role assigned to him before he was old enough to understand what it meant. Nick was smaller, more fragile, and always seen as a child needing special care. Therefore, Jake learned to give in early on, giving up toys without arguing, giving up space without complaining, and even giving up the explanations he deserved. He's still a child. Jake heard that phrase repeated over and over, and each time, he would just silently nod, swallowing down emotions he couldn't put into words. Being an older brother became a long lesson in patience. Jake believed that love meant silence, endurance, and never making things more complicated than necessary. Those moments quietly etched themselves into his mind, little by little shaping how he perceived his place in the family. Nick was a child who always drew attention. When Nick lost his temper, everything around him seemed to stop until he calmed down. When Nick cried, the whole room revolved around him. Jake learned to retreat into a corner, reassure himself, and remain silent to avoid escalating the situation. "I'm okay," Jake would often say, though rarely did anyone actually ask. This adaptive habit initially stemmed from love, but over the years, it transformed into something else. It became Jake's way of silently blurring his own path within the family. Rob Reiner and Michelle loved Nick deeply. They loved him with a love mixed with fear, the familiar fear of parents who worry that if they let go even a little, their child will spiral out of control. They protected Nick, defended him, and believed that with enough patience, everything would be all right. Jake remembered his father often laughing off Nick's outbursts, trying to keep the atmosphere light. Jake remembered his mother pulling Nick aside, whispering that he was just having a hard time. Jake stood beside them, understanding their good intentions, but silently sensing a growing distance. Jake had never blamed his parents for loving Nick so much. He knew they were doing their best to keep his younger brother from going astray. But as Jake grew older, he increasingly felt himself becoming the one shouldering the rest: calmness, responsibility, and the role of a child who was never allowed to cause trouble. "I'm used to it," Jake once told his mother, half jokingly. Michelle smiled, unaware that it was a very quiet, almost invisible plea for help. Jake's teenage years were intertwined with baseball. It was a family tradition, passed down from his grandfather to his father, and then from father to son. Rob would often take Jake to Dodger Stadium, the two of them sitting together through dozens of games each season, sharing quiet moments under the California sun. "My father passed his love of baseball on to me, and I passed it on to Jake," Rob once said proudly. He remembered trips to the Cooperstown Hall of Fame, simple moments that brought tears to his eyes from the sheer joy of fatherhood. But even during those years, Nick's presence was ever present. When Nick was around 15, he began struggling with addiction at a very young age. Initially, the signs were almost imperceptible: a vacant stare, sudden outbursts of anger, nights of unexplained disappearances. Jake recalled looking at his brother and thinking, "He's crying for help." But that cry was gradually drowned out in the growing chaos, and no one really knew what to do before things spiraled out of control. What began quietly gradually became undeniable. Year after year, Jake watched Nick drift between school and treatment centers, leaving and returning, each time a new beginning. With each promise Nick made, the family allowed themselves to hope once more. Jake remembered evenings Nick sitting at the dinner table, his hands trembling slightly, his voice small and hesitant as he said, "This time I'll be okay, really." Rob nodded. Michelle held Nick's hand tightly, placing all her faith in that moment. Jake stood beside them, wanting to believe too, but also afraid, for he had believed so many times before. For Jake, the deepest pain wasn't just watching his brother struggle. It was watching his parents slowly wear themselves down after each cycle, draining what little they had left. Those years left a clear mark on Rob. He seemed to age faster than time, his shoulders weighed down by the constant burden of worry. The house grew quieter, and the silence deepened with each passing month. Michelle lived in a state of endless waiting. Waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for a text message, waiting for any sign that Nick was still safe. Each silence was heavy. Each lack of response held a fear she never put into words. Jake had overheard his mother whispering in the kitchen, her voice trembling and almost breaking. "As long as he's breathing, I won't give up." That sentence was etched into Jake's memory and never truly left him. There were nights when Nick came home completely out of control. Jake saw his father instinctively stand between the two brothers, like a shield erected without thinking. Behind closed doors, Michelle wept silently, careful not to let Nick see her tears. It was in those moments that Jake realized their family was no longer living like a normal family. They were merely existing, hour by hour, day by day. The house was no longer a home. It had become a tense space, thick with unspoken fear. "We have to save the boy," Rob once said. Jake didn't respond, because in his mind, only another question echoed. Who would save those who were trying to save others? Over the years, Jake learned to observe more than to speak. He became reserved, secretive, always assessing the situation before acting. Gradually, the thought of leaving home formed, not out of anger, but out of survival instinct. He feared fame, feared his privacy being eroded little by little. He feared living in the spotlight, while carrying a family pain he could never fully explain to the public. Once, standing backstage and watching others step into the spotlight, Jake quietly wondered if he belonged there. Sometimes, he would whisper softly, almost a murmur to himself, "What if this path wasn't mine?" That question haunted him throughout his teenage years and into adulthood, never receiving a complete answer. Despite bearing the prestigious Reiner surname, Jake didn't rush into the spotlight. He chose a different path, one built on caution and necessary distance. Jake attended Syracuse University, majoring in broadcast journalism, where his passion for storytelling finally found its place. "I only have one other passion," Jake once said. "My passion is news." That's how he defined himself, separating himself from his father's overwhelming shadow and creating something truly his own. After graduating, Jake started from humble beginnings, steadily progressing with rare perseverance. He worked at local stations, then moved to KPRC Channel 2 in Houston for the next few years. Colleagues respected him for his composure, professionalism, and ability to connect, especially in serious and sensitive news reports. Step by step, Jake's career continued to expand, from local news to larger markets, from everyday stories to sports. His steady voice and focused gaze became familiar to viewers who trusted him through each night broadcast. But when the camera lights went out and the microphones were removed, silence returned. Alone at home, Jake often confronted the emptiness that had followed him for years. During his time working in Houston and later at KCBS and Call in Los Angeles, Jake lived the full life of a professional reporter, but the rest of his life, quiet and full of cracks, remained, waiting to be called upon. Long nights, breaking news, chilly scenes, and high-pressure interviews. All were handled by Jake with honesty and a rare degree of restraint. He never turned his back on his family legacy, but always maintained a healthy distance. Jake built his reputation through hard work, not privilege. He persevered in a world that never slowed down, where every mistake could be exaggerated and every moment of weakness scrutinized. Jake's love for baseball never faded. He co-hosted the podcast Incline Dodgers, where he and his friends talked about the sport with humor, frankness, and sincerity, a unique way of preserving family tradition without ostentation. Whenever Jake mentioned KCBS, his posture seemed to shift slightly. His back straightened, as if it were still a solid foundation. He recalled the night shifts, the tragedies of others he had reported on, with the composure of someone who understood his responsibility. "I chose journalism," Jake once said softly, "because I thought if I stayed behind a story, life wouldn't call my name." He smiled faintly, a smile that barely reached his eyes, like a blurry scratch on glass. "I was wrong," Jake admitted very softly. That single, brief sentence contained years of self-doubt and belated realizations. Not long after, Jake returned to acting, not as a familiar heir seeking fame, but as a latecomer, carrying with him the reserve, anxiety, and life experience accumulated over the years. The roles came slowly, from television to film, from comedy to dramatic roles requiring depth. Each role Jake approached cautiously, almost cautiously to the point of difficulty. Jake never made a big fuss. He didn't seek attention, nor did he try to hog the spotlight. Instead, he quietly immersed himself in stories with a quiet depth, the kind of depth only found in those who have faced countless crossroads and carefully considered each choice. Gradually, audiences began to notice something different. This wasn't just Rob Reiner's son in a role. This was an actor with his own rhythm, carrying his own sadness and a restrained style, leaving a lasting impression long after the scene ended. Around 2023, Jake reached an emotional turning point. He appeared in projects like Curb Your Enthusiasm, For All Mankind, An American Crime Story, gradually building his reputation through each role. But it was the independent film Love and Tax that truly changed how the public perceived him. In that project, Jake took on a leading role demanding inner fragility and subtle emotional control. His performance earned him Best Actor at the 2024 Myrtle Beach International Film Festival, a quiet but significant recognition, confirming what many had begun to realize. Small but impactful roles in projects like this is shock and awe further solidified that position. People began to describe Jake's talent as a rare combination, the sensitivity of a journalist blended with an artistic legacy, creating a solid, subtle, and emotionally precise style. However, the most heartbreaking truth Jake shared wasn't in the awards or recognition. It emerged in the quiet moments on set, between takes, when the noise subsided and his thoughts inevitably drifted to his parents. Every time Jake stood in front of the camera, he felt like he wasn't just acting for the director or the audience. Deep down, he believed he was performing for two people who had watched him his whole life. Rob's image was always vivid, standing somewhere behind the stage, arms crossed, his familiar serious face, but his eyes silently gleaming with pride. Michelle appeared softer, observing in silence, as if capturing every moment with an invisible camera that only she could see. Some evenings, Jake would call home, trying to keep his voice calm while his heart pounded like a child waiting for recognition. He talked about his new roles, the stressful auditions, and his first leading role in an independent film after competing against thousands of others. "I did it," Jake said half-jokingly. On the other end of the line, Rob was silent, a familiar silence Jake had known since childhood. Then he replied succinctly, "I knew." Michelle smiled, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mom always knew you'd find your place." Jake held on to those words like precious treasures. Each small award, each quiet compliment, his first instinct was to share them. He sent behind-the-scenes photos, articles, short videos hastily filmed on his phone. Michelle responded with long, warm, and sincere messages. Rob remained concise and direct, but Jake understood that within that brevity lay an unspoken pride. "You're on the right track," his father had once written. Jake reread that sentence countless times, as if each reading was a reminder that he wasn't alone. Throughout his filmmaking journey, Jake held on to a belief as Christmas approached. Finally, he would return home after years of absence, silence, and busyness. In his imagination, he saw himself sitting in the old living room, recounting his accomplishments like belated gifts. Rob nodded slowly. Michelle squeezed his hand. "Our son," she said. Just thinking about it warmed Jake's heart. Jake had planned everything. The flight, the gifts, even the words he would say as he walked through the door and declared, "I'm home." He truly believed that moment would bridge the gap, dissolve old misunderstandings, and finally allow him to stand before his parents, no longer a child searching for his place, but a man who had truly found his place in life. Jake believed he had finally returned home, returned as a man his parents could be proud of. And then, without warning, it all crumbled so quickly he barely had time to comprehend what was happening. On December 14th, while Jake was finishing a film in New York, the news struck like a cold, cruel blow, sudden, violent, and completely unprepared. His parents were gone. The two people who had been his steadfast pillars through every storm of his life, had been taken from him in the very home that held his childhood memories. The place that had once offered a sense of security had suddenly become a space associated with the unimaginable. Before Jake could even catch his breath, another piece of news arrived, even heavier and more shocking. His younger brother, Nick, had been named as a suspect. Jake couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. He stood frozen, not collapsing, not screaming, only feeling as if he were drifting, as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished. Christmas instantly lost all meaning. It was no longer a reunion, but a cold, empty space, where the two chairs in the old house would forever remain unoccupied. The silence that followed was suffocating. Pain spread through his body, each passing second heavy like an unceasing wave. Jake immediately flew back to Los Angeles and reunited with his sister Romy. The two siblings were almost speechless. They could only hug each other tightly, weeping, clinging to the fragile warmth of their family. Later, they both acknowledged that the pain was beyond human endurance, a relentless emotion that clung to them, creeping into every moment of lucidity. But at that moment, Jake felt utterly alone. The dazzling lights of Hollywood suddenly seemed cold and distant, as if he were standing in a world devoid of meaning. Then the pain began to transform. Anger didn't come immediately, but when it did, it erupted violently. Jake began to speak even harder truths, things that stunned and silenced his listeners. "I warned them," he said, his voice trembling. "I warned my parents 3 months ago." Those words weren't just a fit of anger, but the result of fear and helplessness that had been simmering within him for years. Jake explained that months before the tragedy, he had contacted his parents not in anger, nor after an argument. He called out of genuine fear. He told them he no longer felt safe. Even repeating it later, his body reacted. Just a loud noise was enough to make his hands tremble. At that time, Nick was going through a serious crisis and talking about coming home. Jake panicked. He called his parents immediately, his voice urgent, almost pleading for them to be careful. "Please don't let him move back," Jake warned. "Please be careful. I'm scared." It wasn't a judgment, but the cry of someone who had witnessed the signs of danger for too long. He told them he feared that one day something irreversible would happen. Recalling that moment, Jake's jaw tightened, the overwhelming emotion suffocating him. Jake wasn't accusing his brother. He was pleading with his parents to set boundaries. He wanted them to protect themselves, to take things slowly, not to let hope overshadow safety. If not for his son, he remembered saying, then for their own sake. It wasn't the voice of a bitter brother. It was the voice of a son, fearful and helpless in the face of something beyond his control. But Rob and Michelle reacted in their usual way, with hope, with forgiveness, with unconditional love. They believed that love could heal all wounds. They believed that patience and care would help their youngest son find stability again. They believed that giving Nick a home would help him get back on his feet. Jake vividly remembered his father's image during those conversations. Calm, trusting, always choosing hope over fear. And that memory clung to Jake, heavy and indelible, as all the things he had warned against finally came crashing down at once. Rob's voice echoed in his mind that night, gentle and steady as always. "Son," he said, "Nick is trying to change. We are family. We have to be together." Michelle expressed similar hope, promising that they would monitor him, help Nick through this difficult period, that everything would be all right. Jake tried to argue one last time. He told them about Nick's violent outbursts, recalling the years his brother lived a wandering, unstable, and lost life. He spoke of the darkness that addiction had sown within Nick. But as always, compassion prevailed. Now the unimaginable had happened. "I never thought he could do something like this." Jake burst into tears, his voice breaking completely. The pain poured out, unconcealed, so raw that viewers could hardly hold back their own tears. Initially, that pain quickly transformed into a raging rage. A rage directed straight at Nick, the brother Jake had once loved, protected, shielded from the world. "Nick killed our parents," Jake said, tears streaming down his face. "Nick destroyed everything. I warned them, but no one listened." The feeling of betrayal cut deeper than anything Jake had ever experienced. But the anger didn't last. It slowly crumbled inward, transforming into a heavy burden of guilt weighing down his chest. Jake began to question himself over and over again. Should he have flown home sooner? Should he have pressed harder? Shouldn't he have screamed, instead of just pleading desperately? If I had come back sooner, he mumbled, his eyes empty and lifeless. Would things have been different? The question hung in the air, unanswered, leaving only endless torment. Then, when speaking of Nick, Jake's emotions became so jumbled they were impossible to name. Anger, grief, pity, doubt, all surged at once. He's my brother, Jake said, his voice trembling with conflict. But he's also the one who took my parents away. He turned away, as if the words were too heavy to face. His body slumped completely, shoulders hunched, back arched, hands shaking uncontrollably. Tears fell silently, relentlessly, as if the pain of years of suppression had finally burst forth. I warned them, Jake repeated after Nick Reiner's arrest. Not long after, Jake's phone rang. A text message. A name. He knew who it was even before looking at the screen. His stomach tightened. Jake hesitated for a long time, knowing that simply answering could drag him back into the nightmare that still wouldn't let go. Nick's voice on the other end was urgent and frantic. He spoke incessantly, as if afraid that even a moment of silence would cause Jake to hang up. Nick insisted that he hadn't done what everyone was saying, that things had spiraled out of control, that it was all a terrible mistake. Please believe me, Nick said, his voice trembling. You're the only one left. Jake closed his eyes, his hand gripping the phone so tightly it ached. That voice had once belonged to a boy he had spent his life protecting. Then Nick mentioned the number. For $1 million in bail. A cold number, appearing like a final lifeline. Nick begged Jake for help, using money, connections, anything he had left, to get him out of here. I can't survive here, Nick said, almost in tears. Please, just this once. Every word Nick uttered struck Jake's heart, where brotherly love and unbearable pain clashed violently. Jake was silent for a long time. Images of Rob and Michelle, two people who would never have a chance of survival, flashed through his mind. He could hear his own breathing, heavy and ragged, as if he were standing between two cliffs, unsure which way to go. Nick, Jake finally spoke, his voice low and weary. I can't. Those slow words carried a cold, hard weight. I can't use money to escape the truth. On the other end of the line, Nick exploded, furious and desperate. He accused Jake of betraying him, of abandoning him like everyone else. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. I'm not abandoning you, he said, his voice trembling. But I can't save you this way either. It was no longer a purely rational decision. It was the final line Jake was forced to draw. Too late, and at a cruelly painful price. The call ended abruptly, the sound of heavy breathing fading into silence. Jake stared at the dark screen, feeling as if he had just severed the last thread connecting him to his brother. He didn't know if Nick believed him. He didn't even know if the decision was right or wrong. The only thing Jake was certain of was a bitter truth. Sometimes, love isn't enough to save a person, and realizing that might be the cruelest punishment. As the news broadcast ended on the night of December 17th, many viewers remained motionless in front of their screens. No one rushed to change channels, as if simply standing up would shatter the weight of what they had just witnessed. The story didn't explode in the way tragedies usually do. There was no loud argument, no wave of outrage, no sensational headlines to grab attention. Instead, there were brief, fragmented, quiet responses that spoke louder than any screams. I couldn't breathe after watching it. I've never seen a news report so heartbreaking. Tonight, he wasn't a reporter. He was a son. Many admitted to crying, even though they had never known the Reiner family before. Others said they felt confused, even uncomfortable, watching, as if they were inadvertently witnessing something too private and fragile. Some turned off their TVs midair only to turn them back on a few minutes later, too brave to continue, but unable to leave. One viewer wrote, I'm used to watching the news to understand other people's lives. Tonight, I felt like I was seeing a pain that no one should have to bear in public. That feeling of guilt lingered, heavy and unnameable. The online discussions that followed reflected the same emotional divide. On one hand, there was grief for the legacy of Rob Reiner, who had brought laughter and warmth to generations, now shrouded in tragedy. On the other, there was sorrow for Jake and Romy, the surviving children, forced to confront what was described as an unimaginable loss. They didn't just lose their parents. One comment, which garnered thousands of replies, read, "They lost the very concept of family." That news became a silent reminder. That night, many hugged their loved ones tighter than usual. They called siblings, parents, friends, only to hear a familiar voice. Jake's tragedy was no longer just his story. It touched a deep-seated fear many carry but rarely dare to speak of, that everything can crumble, even in the places they believe are safest. In the days that followed, Jake struggled intensely. Sleep offered no rest. His mind replayed moments, warnings, conversations that were now irreversible. His anger wouldn't dissipate. It smoldered within his grief, fueled by the same unyielding question. For 3 months, he thought. Just 3 months ago, he'd said everything he could. If only they had listened. If only they had been more careful. From the outside, Jake Reiner's life had seemed like a straight, bright path. A respected family name, a thriving career, a voice growing. But when it was all taken away, all that remained was a man who had lived in silence for too long, carried too many ignored warnings, and a tragedy rooted in his own blood. Jake had seen the danger early on. He had spoken. He had tried to protect. And that's what made his pain deeper, heavier, and far beyond any ordinary loss. Loss doesn't just fade away. It settles, becoming a lifelong burden of regret. Jake didn't just lose his parents in a single moment of heartbreak. He also lost the belief that enough love and warnings could have prevented disaster. His journalism career, his acting career, the achievements he once dreamed of bringing home now seem insignificant in the face of an unanswered question. If they had listened that day, would things have turned out differently? Jake continues to walk, carrying a wound that will never heal. Grief, anger, guilt, and a love with nowhere else to be placed silently accompany him. Time passes, but some losses aren't measured in days, but in moments that could have changed everything. Speaking out was never about seeking attention. It was a final, desperate, yet sincere effort to transform personal pain into a warning to others. Jake's story reminds us that family needs more than just love. It needs listening, clear boundaries, and vigilance when danger arises. There are mistakes that leave no room for correction. There are Christmases that will never return. Thank you for following this story to the end. If it resonated with you, if it made you pause and think, or if you've ever experienced something similar, please leave a comment below. Not to judge, but to share and listen to each other. And if you want to continue following these insightful, authentic stories about the people behind the headlines, please like this video, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next content. Thank you for watching, and thank you for staying.